Hello, I am Greg Harris, President of Watson Title Services of North Florida Incorporated, and I'll be guiding you through a multi-part discussion of the replacement for the HUD-1 for those closings involving a mortgage that is written after Saturday, October 3rd. In official documents, you may see this referred to as the TILA-RESPA Integrated Disclosure, TRID, or TRID rule implementation, but most people will simply call it the new closing disclosure rules, new settlement statement, or the replacement for the HUD. For our purposes, let's just refer to it in the new rules that come along with it as the new closing disclosure. Many of you may recall that the original implementation was August 1st of 2015. That was changed early in the summer of 2015 to the October date. You may have also heard that there is a regulatory grace period until the new year. Grace period is perhaps too strong of a word. What the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the CFPB, is doing is simply, from an enforcement point of view, going to be understanding to those who make a good faith effort to comply with the rule, but for a variety of reasons beyond their control, may not fully follow the requirements. For you, the real estate professional, though, what is important for you to remember is simply this date, October 3rd, 2015. That's when things start to get different. We know that there are a lot of changes that are coming up involving the new rules and the new documents, but just want to let you know we're here to help you understand these changes and how they're going to impact buyers, sellers, and their real estate professionals. In this video, we'll cover just page 1 of the closing disclosure. And this video is just one part of a larger series of training sessions you can access over at Watson Title Services of North Florida's YouTube page. That way you can view it and other videos as many times as you like at a time of your convenience. We're going to go over each page of the closing disclosure section by section. At the end of the video and at the bottom of each slide, you'll find our email address and phone number. If you have more questions or would like a clarification on something that we bring up, please reach out and let us know. For now, though, let's go ahead and dive right in. First thing, let's review some of the above-the-fold essentials. The new closing disclosure only applies to mortgages written after October 3rd of 2015, as we've said before. Cash closings will use a different settlement statement. We refer to it, and I think most people will, the ALTA settlement statement. And cash closings will not have the same timeline requirements that we find for those closings that we deal with a mortgage. So that's one thing that won't change. Cash closings will still be the wild, wild west. As a result, though, for those closings that do involve a mortgage, with the October 3rd activation date, we really won't see the new closing disclosure at the closing table until mid-November at the very earliest. The new closing disclosure and some of the rather rigid timeline requirements, they're the result of the central focus of the CFPB. They are focused on making sure that the interest of the consumer, which is the buyer, for real estate closings are protected. And it's important to keep in mind the C in CFPB, consumer. And when they talk about consumer, they are talking about the buyer, and all these steps are designed to help protect the buyer in the course of a real estate purchase. Another change that we're going to see in how we do business is going to be what is really the primary driver of when we're going to close. The desired closing date that the buyer and the seller want to have really is not going to determine when this deal will close because of the very rigid and firm delivery date and disclosure requirements. The lender's production and approval of the closing disclosure and when they received a confirmation from the consumer that they received it, that really is going to drive the date. And we all need to make sure that we have those expectations fully explained by everybody involved in the transaction, especially those that have closed in the last few years and may not fully understand how things have changed. The CFPB has also brought with it some new terms to use and incorporate into our lexicon when we conduct business. For closings, we're used to calling it the HUD. That's now going to be called the closing disclosure. The TIL and the GFE, the loan estimate. Lender is now the creditor. The borrower is, of course, the consumer. We no longer will be talking about tolerances. They'll be called variants. And what we now usually refer to as closing or settlement, you'll often see referred to as the consummation date. However, I do expect out in the field, we will continue to use the phrases closing or settlement. Consummation will probably just be used in official documentation. Now let's look at some of the timeline requirements. The lender has very strict requirements for delivery of the closing disclosure. The lender has to ensure that the borrower has the closing disclosure 3 business days prior to closing. The settlement agent, that's us, will supply the closing disclosure to the seller, copy to the creditor, but is the buyer that is the driver on delivery requirements. And I'll touch on this again, but the closing disclosure that we're going to be going over here is the closing disclosure the buyer will receive. Different lenders will operate differently, but this is not everybody is going to see this. This is for the buyer. The seller will have his own closing disclosure, but the big driver here, again focused on the consumer, which is the buyer, is the buyer's closing disclosure. And at least for the next few videos, that's what we'll be closing on. We'll have a separate video that will discuss the seller's disclosure that the title company, the settlement agent, will control and will deliver to the seller when that is needed. But the timelines for the buyer's closing disclosure for that 3-day disclosure. The only way you're really going to get the clock to start clicking for 3 days is if it is hand delivered. Then you immediately will have the 3-day clock starting. Other ways that they can be delivered: U.S. mail, email, or even overnight delivery. Important things to remember there: even if you use any type of receipt for delivery, whether it's the UPS, FedEx, overnight tracking number, or you have registered mail that has return receipt requested, or on email where you use little options that tell you when it's delivered in red, that is not considered, at least at this point, a consumer confirmed receipt of the document. You will need to have, the lender will tell you what is needed for their requirements. Something that is positive, affirmed, has a date where the consumer actually says, I have it, I've read it, I've signed it, I've dated it. Here's the bottom of page 5. As a result, you could expect, unless you're in a situation where hand delivery is an option from the lender, that the 3 days really is 6 days. And that are 6 days that count for the purposes or the CFPB working days, which we'll describe in some detail here in a moment. For most processes the lenders will be using 2, even there that may not be exactly the amount of days. I think for planning purposes, as we wait for the new rule to get implemented and we see how things go, you really need to look at about 10 calendar days prior to the closing that all of the items that will need to be on the closing disclosure will need to be delivered to your settlement service provider so they can be given to the lender so the lender can produce it in a timely manner, in an accurate manner, and for it to be delivered and then in the hands of the consumer to review for those 3-day periods. So when you're looking at a particular date, you need to back up and make sure that everything that needs to be on that closing disclosure has been supplied to the settlement services provider, which will usually be giving the information to the lender 10 days before closing. We'll have a separate video that goes over that in additional detail, so you can go over to our YouTube page and see that additional detail. Now that 3-day disclosure period can be retriggered. I kind of look at it as 3 plus 1. The big 3 items involve changes in the loan. if there is a prepayment penalty added after delivery, if the loan product changes, or if the APR increases in any amount, then the disclosure period will need to be reset. Whether it's 3 or 6 days will determine whether it's hand delivered or not. And the +1 to the 3+1, on the bottom of page 5, you see a note about the appraisal. You can read right here, or 3 days before closing, you need a copy of that. If that comes into play, that might be another reason why the closing might have to be delayed. I want to give a little note here, something I mentioned a few minutes ago concerning delivery timelines. And you'll see a nice example on a calendar on that separate video where I go over the timeline. But the CFPB has their own definition of working days. The CFPB has defined working days for the purpose of the buyer's closing disclosure as being Monday through Saturday. Sunday is not a working day. And you have the 10 federal holidays that also are not considered working days. So again, Monday through Saturday are your working days, except for those 10 holidays. Very important to keep in mind, because many people think working days of just Monday through Friday, and it does not matter who is or is not working either. So my recommendation for everybody, go ahead and give people a hard calendar date, so no people confuse calendar date, work days, whose definition of work days. Just stick to a strict calendar date, and that should make everything nice and clear for everybody. Now let's go ahead and dive right into it. For those that are very comfortable with the 2010 HUD statement, the new closing disclosure really is not that big of a leap or a radical change. And there are many things about it that are a great improvement, and that I think that both you and your customers will enjoy compared to some of the items on the 2010 HUD that make it difficult to understand unless it's really explained well to you. I think the key to understanding each page is to go over it section by section, and once you get each section, it all flows well from there. But here's an overview of page 1, and as you see it breaks into nice bite-sized pieces, and that's how we're going to attack it, one bite at a time. And let's start in the upper left-hand corner with the closing information. This is where you'll find the basic information for the closing disclosure and the consummation closing itself. The date issued is the date the closing disclosure is delivered to the consumer. Don't be confused in this example where all the dates are the same. This is a theoretical point where you could, if you're working locally, have a change made, delivered at the same time, and everything dispersed on the same day. But the resetting of the 3-day clock and the actual dates will probably be a little different than what you see here. So please don't be confused. Everything else here is fairly straightforward. Settlement agent is a company, not the individual who is actually sitting at the table. That file number will not be your company's file number. It'll be usually for the mortgager or the settlement service provider, whoever's creating the document. And the sales price is always the contract sales price. You may see somewhere that would be the appraised value, but that's only for refinances. But that's really not a concern for most real estate professionals. So that's just your contract sales price. Let's move on to the next, the transaction information. This is also fairly straightforward, and there are occasions where there isn't enough room to fit the name of the buyer or the seller. An example might be a trust company, a trust or company name. In that case, there will need to be an addendum that will include all the required information for this specific field. Next is the loan information. This provides a snapshot of the loan information. A new item that may not be familiar to some of you is the MIC number. That's your mortgage insurance case number, if applicable, for the loan in question. Also note the loan ID number. That will be in the bottom right-hand corner of every page of the buyer's closing disclosure, and you do want to make sure that number is constant and there hasn't been a change somewhere along the line. We then get to the box that contains the information on the loan terms. It covers the loan amount, interest rate, monthly principal, and interest. To the right of these numbers, the lender must make an affirmative statement if any of these items can change. There's also a clear statement about any prepayment penalty or if there is a balloon payment. The projected payments box has a lot of important information. It shows the consumer what during the life of the loan the monthly payments will be. In this example, the loan has PMI, private mortgage insurance. As a result, this shows what the payments will be in years 1 through 7 and then 8 through 30 after PMI drops off. In the bottom section of this, the lender is required to show the total other payments besides principal and interest that will be included. The extra taxes and assessments are included so to give the consumer a better idea what it will cost them to be able to carry this loan on a monthly basis. In this example, the lender has included homeowners association dues. They also have to show what is or is not included in escrow. The last box on page 1, closing cost, shows calculations from figures on page 2 and 3. The closing cost described in a variety of fields that we'll cover in additional videos for the series. It also provides the figure for cash to close. One note that we'll discuss over in page 2 is the rule requires Florida and 20 other states to inaccurately report cash to close. But we're going to cover that in great detail in the next video on page 2. So keep that in mind. Be patient with the process as we already have a fix in, but there's really nothing Florida and other 20 states can do because it's a federal requirement that's kind of being forced on all 50 states. But let not your heart be troubled. The fix is in, and by the time your customers get to the closing table, even though the buyer's closing disclosure and the seller's closing disclosure will have incorrect cash to close, they'll have a page right behind it that gives them that exact number they need, and they'll have it well before the closing table as well. But this gets us to the end of page 1 of the new closing disclosure. Now make sure and head back to YouTube and to our webpage there on YouTube and catch the rest of the series page by page. If you subscribe to our YouTube page, you'll also get automatic updates every time a new video is posted, either about additional documents that we have with the new rule or other title related videos we think will be a help to you and your customers understanding the closing process. As always, if you have additional questions or would like clarification on any of the parts of the new closing disclosure, just give me a call or drop me an email. Thank you, and I hope you have a great and prosperous year.